Stop for a moment and consider this carefully. Your mind is not waiting for instructions. It is already receiving them. Every hour, every conversation, every image, every environment you step into is shaping you, quietly, consistently, and without asking for your permission. There is no neutral state. You are either being programmed or you are programming yourself. Most men believe their thoughts are their own, that their opinions are original, that their decisions are the result of independent thinking. But look closer. Where did those thoughts begin? And why do they repeat so easily? That is the question most avoid. Because the answer is uncomfortable. You are influenced more than you realize. Not in obvious ways, but in subtle, repeated exposures that shape your perception over time. And unless you recognize this, you will live out patterns that were never consciously chosen. Let me ask you something directly. Why do you think the way you do about money, success, and your own potential? Did you deliberately choose those beliefs, or did they form gradually through repetition, environment, and exposure? Repetition is the mechanism. What you hear often becomes familiar. What becomes familiar begins to feel true. And what feels true starts to guide your decisions automatically, without effort, without resistance, without question. That is how programming works. Not through force, through consistency. You do not wake up one day and decide to think small. You absorb limitations slowly, through daily exposure, through conversations, media, surroundings, and subtle reinforcement that conditions your expectations, until limitation feels normal. And once something feels normal, it becomes invisible. This is how potential is reduced. Not by lack of ability, but by unseen influence shaping your belief about what is possible. And once belief is limited, action follows. Because you will never act beyond what you believe is attainable. Action always follows belief. If you believe success is difficult, you will approach it with hesitation. If you believe opportunity is rare, you will not pursue it aggressively. If you believe you are not ready, you will delay. And all of it will feel logical because it has been repeated. Have you ever noticed how certain thoughts return without effort? Doubt, comparison, delay, the quiet voice that questions your ability just as you are about to act. That is not random, it is programming repeating itself, and repetition strengthens it. Each time you entertain the same thought, you reinforce it. Each time you accept it without challenge, you make it more familiar. And over time, it becomes automatic part of your identity. This is where control is lost. Not in one moment, but gradually. You begin to react instead of direct, to follow instead of choose, to think in patterns that were installed over time without ever questioning their origin. But familiarity is not truth. It is repetition. And repetition can be changed, but only if it is seen. Because what remains unseen continues to operate without resistance. It shapes your decisions quietly, guiding your actions while you believe you are in control. This is why awareness is power. The moment you recognize what is influencing you, you regain the ability to choose, to accept or reject, to replace or reinforce, and that choice determines the direction of your life, because the mind does not filter for you. It accepts what is repeated. So if you do not choose what enters your mind, something else will choose for you. And that something will not always lead you toward growth, clarity, or success. It will lead you toward familiarity, and familiarity often leads you back to where you started. In this lesson, you will uncover 7 specific forces that are shaping your thinking right now. Not obvious forces, but subtle ones. The kind that operate quietly, influencing your perception without demanding attention. You will begin to notice patterns. You will recognize thoughts that do not belong to you. And once you see them, you will have the power to change them. But understand this clearly. This is not about avoiding influence. That is impossible. This is about controlling it, because your mind is always open, always absorbing, always building, always forming beliefs based on what it receives repeatedly. And what it builds will eventually shape your results. So the question is not whether you are being programmed. You are. The question is, by what? And once you answer that, something shifts. You stop reacting. You begin choosing. And the moment you begin choosing what enters your mind, you begin to shape what comes out of your life. There is a condition which governs the life of nearly every man, yet remains largely unnoticed. It is not a force that announces itself with authority, nor does it compel obedience through command. It operates quietly, persistently, and without resistance. It is the acceptance of thought without question. If I were to begin again, I would first seek to understand this condition, for it is here that control is either lost or gained. Most men believe their thoughts are their own. They assume that what they think, they have chosen. That their opinions are formed through reason. That their conclusions are the result of deliberate consideration. Yet if they were to examine closely, they would discover that many of their most frequent thoughts did not originate within them at all. They were received, repeated, accepted, and in time believed. The mind does not distinguish, in its early reception, between what is true and what is merely familiar. It accepts what is presented often. It adopts what is heard repeatedly. It gives weight not to accuracy, but to frequency. This is the beginning of influence. A man hears an idea once, and it passes. He hears it again, and it becomes noticeable. He hears it often, and it begins to feel correct, not because it has been proven, but because it has been repeated. Familiarity, when unexamined, takes the place of truth, and this substitution is rarely detected. For the man does not feel that he has accepted something from without. He feels that he has arrived at a conclusion from within. The thought appears natural. It carries no sign of its origin. It presents itself as his own. Thus, he does not question it. And what is not questioned is accepted. What is accepted is repeated. And what is repeated becomes belief. This process is gradual. It does not occur in a single moment. It unfolds over time, through small exposures, through ordinary conversation, through observation of others, through the constant flow of impressions that pass through the mind each day. No single instance appears significant, yet together they form structure. If I were to begin again, I would recognize that my mind is not empty, waiting to be filled by deliberate thought. It is already active, already receiving, already forming patterns based on what it encounters. There is no neutral state. The mind is always being influenced. The question is not whether influence is present, it is whether it is recognized. Most men never arrive at this recognition. They proceed through life under the assumption that their thinking is independent. They do not pause to examine why certain ideas return to them with ease, why certain doubts arise at particular moments, why certain limitations feel reasonable. They accept these thoughts because they are familiar, and familiarity feels safe. Yet safety is not truth, it is repetition. There are thoughts which appear at the moment of decision, thoughts that suggest delay, thoughts that question ability, thoughts that diminish expectation. These thoughts are not random. They are the result of prior influence. They have been installed gradually through repeated exposure until they operate without effort. And because they require no effort, they are rarely challenged. If I were to begin again, I would not accept a thought simply because it appears easily. I would not assume that what comes to mind belongs there. I would question its origin. I would examine its effect. I would determine whether it serves my direction or opposes it. For the mind, when left unguarded, does not filter for purpose. It accepts for familiarity. This distinction is critical, for a man may be guided by thoughts that do not serve him, yet he follows them willingly, believing them to be his own. He delays when he could advance. He hesitates when he could act. He lowers his aim without recognizing that it has been lowered. All of this occurs without force, without awareness, without resistance. This is the power of silent acceptance. It does not require agreement. It requires only repetition. Consider how easily a man adopts the expectations of those around him. If he is surrounded by limitation, he begins to accept limitation. If he hears repeatedly that success is difficult, he begins to approach it with caution. If he observes hesitation, he begins to hesitate. He does not decide these things consciously, he absorbs them, and once absorbed, they become part of his thinking. From thinking, they pass into action. From action, they produce result. Thus, the origin of many results lies not in deliberate choice, but in unconscious acceptance. If I were beginning again, I would reverse this process. I would refuse to accept thought without examination. I would not permit repetition alone to determine belief. I would become aware. Awareness is the first step toward control. Without it, a man lives under the influence of forces he does not see. He reacts rather than directs. He follows patterns rather than creating them. He lives within boundaries that were not consciously chosen. But once awareness is gained, something changes. The man begins to notice. He observes that certain thoughts return frequently. He recognizes that some of them do not serve him. He begins to question. And in questioning, he interrupts the process. The thought no longer passes without resistance. It is examined, and through examination, its influence is weakened. This is the beginning of authority, not over the world, but over the mind. If I were to state this plainly, I would say, the greatest danger is not that a man will think incorrectly. It is that he will accept thoughts without knowing that he has done so. For once a thought is accepted, it operates, it influences action, it shapes expectation, it directs behavior, and it does so quietly without announcing its presence. There is no signal that a belief has been formed. There is only the result that follows. If I were beginning again, I would treat every repeated thought with attention, not fear, not resistance, but awareness. I would ask, where did this originate? Why does it return? Does it serve my direction? Or does it lead me away from it? In asking these questions, I would begin to separate what is mine from what has been given. And in that separation, I would regain control. Others would begin to notice this change. They would observe that the man does not react as before. He does not accept every suggestion. He does not follow every common belief. He pauses. He considers. He chooses. This choice is the mark of independence. Not independence of action alone, but independence of thought. And this form of independence is rare. For most men are guided by what they have heard often, not by what they have chosen deliberately. The man who begins to choose his thoughts becomes different. He becomes directed. He becomes intentional. He becomes less influenced by the opinions of others and more guided by his own examination. This produces a form of quiet strength, not visible in outward display, but evident in consistency. For when a man governs his thoughts, his actions follow. And when his actions are consistent, his results become predictable. If I were to express this as instruction, I would say, do not accept every thought that enters your mind. Examine it, question it, choose it. Let this be fixed firmly within. I do not accept thought without awareness. I examine what I receive. I choose what I repeat. Repeat this not for comfort, but for direction. For the mind, when guided repeatedly, begins to follow instruction. And when instruction replaces unconscious acceptance, control is established. Thus, if I were to begin again from nothing, I would begin here. Not with changing action, not with seeking opportunity, but with seeing clearly. For what is seen may be changed, and what is unseen will continue to operate. And in seeing, the man takes the first step, not merely toward success, but toward control of the very force that determines it. Having recognized that thought is often accepted without question. The next realization, if I were to begin again, is that repetition is the force through which such acceptance is secured. For no idea, whether true or false, gains control over the mind in a single instance. It gains control through return, through frequency, through quiet persistence. A man may hear an idea once and dismiss it. He may hear it twice and consider it. But If he hears it continually, without interruption, it begins to settle. It loses its strangeness. It becomes familiar. And what becomes familiar is seldom resisted. The mind does not weigh every idea with equal scrutiny. It does not examine each thought as though it were new. Instead, it develops patterns. It accepts what it has encountered often, and it does so with increasing ease. Thus, repetition becomes a form of influence more powerful than argument. For argument invites resistance. Repetition invites acceptance. If I were beginning again, I would understand that the thoughts which return most frequently are not always the most accurate, but they are the most reinforced. They have been repeated until they require no effort to recall. They arise naturally, without invitation. And because they arise naturally, they are trusted. This trust is rarely questioned. The man assumes that what appears easily must be valid. Yet ease of thought is not proof of truth. It is proof of repetition. There are ideas which, when first encountered, seem uncertain. They may even be rejected. But if they are presented again and again, through different forms, through different voices, through different circumstances, they begin to take root. They do not force themselves upon the mind. They settle into it, quietly, gradually, until they become part of its structure. This is the method by which belief is formed, not through force, but through familiarity. If I were beginning again, I would observe this process carefully. I would notice which ideas are repeated in my hearing, in my surroundings, in the words of others. I would recognize that each repetition is not without effect. It contributes, however slightly, to the formation of belief. And belief, once formed, directs action. There is a subtle transformation that occurs when an idea has been repeated sufficiently. It no longer feels like an external suggestion. It feels internal. It feels personal. The man does not say, "I have heard this often." He says, "I believe this." And in this statement, the process is complete. For belief does not announce its origin. It presents itself as certainty. If I were to ask a man why he believes what he does about his own ability, about success, about limitation, he would rarely trace it back to repetition. He would provide reasons. He would defend his position. Yet beneath those reasons lies a history of exposure. He has heard certain things often, and they have become his truth. This is why repetition must be understood, for it operates whether it is recognized or not. The man who does not choose what is repeated to him will be shaped by what is repeated around him. He will adopt the expectations of his environment, the limitations of his associations, the beliefs that are most commonly expressed in his presence. He will do so gradually, without awareness, without resistance. If I were beginning again, I would not leave this process unattended. I would take control of repetition, for the same force that installs limitation may be used to establish strength. The mind does not discriminate between what weakens and what strengthens. It accepts what is repeated. Therefore, the man who directs repetition directs belief. This is a principle of great importance. If a man repeats to himself, through thought and through word, that he is incapable, he will begin to act accordingly, not because he has proven it, but because he has reinforced it. The idea has become familiar, and familiarity has become belief. Likewise, if he repeats that he is capable, that he will continue, that he will advance, this too becomes familiar. And in time it becomes belief. The difference lies not in the nature of the mind, but in the direction of repetition. If I were beginning again, I would be deliberate in this direction. I would not permit the most frequent thoughts to arise by accident. I would choose them. I would repeat them. I would reinforce them until they become natural. For once a thought becomes natural, it no longer requires effort. It operates, and in operating, it influences action. There is also a connection between repetition and feeling. An idea, when first encountered, may carry little emotion, but when repeated, it begins to attach itself to feeling. It becomes more than a statement. It becomes an expectation. It carries weight. This weight influences behavior. The man does not merely think the idea, he feels it. And what is felt strongly is acted upon readily. Thus, repetition not only forms belief, it strengthens it. If I were beginning again, I would recognize that casual exposure is not without consequence. The conversations I engage in, the words I hear, the thoughts I entertain, all contribute to repetition. And repetition contributes to belief. Therefore, I would guard what is repeated, not with fear, but with intention. I would reduce the influence of ideas that weaken direction. I would increase the presence of ideas that strengthen it, and I would do so consistently. For consistency is required. A single repetition is not enough, nor is a brief period of directed thought. The process must be sustained. The idea must return again and again, until it becomes familiar, until it replaces what was there before. There will be resistance at first, for the mind is accustomed to its existing patterns. It returns easily to what has been repeated often. New ideas feel uncertain. They do not yet possess the same strength, but through continued repetition, this changes. The new becomes familiar. The familiar becomes accepted, and the accepted becomes belief. Others will begin to observe the effect of this change. They will notice that the man no longer expresses the same doubts. He no longer repeats the same limitations. His speech changes. His expectations rise. His actions become more decisive. They may attribute this to confidence, but confidence is the result. The cause is repetition, directed, sustained. If I were to express this as instruction, I would say, be mindful of what is repeated, for what is repeated becomes belief, and belief becomes action. Let this be fixed firmly within the mind. I direct what I repeat. I strengthen what serves me. I replace what does not. Repeat this not as mere words, but as practice, for repetition, when controlled, becomes a tool, and when used deliberately, it shapes the course of a man's thinking. Thus, if I were to begin again from nothing, having gained awareness of thought, I would do this next. I would control repetition, for in controlling repetition, I would control belief, and in controlling belief, I would begin to control the results that follow. Having understood that repetition shapes belief, the next realization, if I were to begin again, is that repetition does not arise by chance. It is supplied in great measure by one's environment. For what surrounds a man determines what is presented to his mind, and what is presented repeatedly becomes what he accepts. Environment is not merely a place. It is a constant influence. It is the sum of what a man hears, observes, and encounters each day. It is the tone of conversation, the nature of association, the standard of expectation that surrounds him. And though it may appear ordinary, it is shaping his thinking continuously. Most men do not recognize this. They believe themselves independent of their surroundings. They assume that their thinking is unaffected by those around them. Yet if they were to examine closely, they would find that their beliefs closely resemble those of the environment in which they remain. This is not coincidence. It is influence. A man does not need to be persuaded directly to adopt an idea. He needs only to be exposed to it repeatedly within his environment. If those around him speak in terms of limitation, he begins to accept limitation. If they speak in terms of possibility, he begins to consider possibility. He absorbs, without effort, without awareness. If I were beginning again, I would give careful attention to this influence. I would recognize that my environment is not neutral. It is either strengthening my direction or weakening it. It is either expanding my expectation or reducing it. There is no condition in which it does neither. A man who remains among those who doubt will find doubt entering his own thinking. Not because he has chosen it, but because it is repeated. It becomes familiar. It settles into his mind without resistance. Likewise, a man who surrounds himself with those who act with purpose will begin to act with greater purpose himself. He will adopt their standard, not through effort, but through exposure. This is the power of association. It operates quietly, yet its effect is profound. If I were to begin again, I would not underestimate this force. I would not assume that I can remain unaffected by what surrounds me. I would accept that I am influenced, and in accepting it, I would choose my influences deliberately. For the man who does not choose his environment is shaped by it, and the shaping occurs gradually. A single conversation does not determine belief, but repeated conversation does. A single observation does not alter expectation, but repeated observation does. Over time, the environment establishes what is normal, and what is normal becomes what is expected. If limitation is normal, limitation is expected. If progress is normal, progress is expected. And expectation governs action. A man will not act beyond what he believes is reasonable. He will not pursue what appears impossible within his environment. He adjusts himself, often unconsciously, to match what he sees and hears most often. Thus, environment does not merely influence thought. It defines the boundaries within which thought operates. If I were beginning again, I would examine these boundaries. I would ask not only what I think, but why I think it. I would observe the conditions that surround me and consider whether they are expanding my thinking or restricting it. For a man may possess great potential, yet remain confined by the expectations of his environment. He may never test his ability, not because he lacks it, but because he has not seen it expressed around him. He has accepted a standard, and he lives within it. This acceptance is rarely questioned. It is assumed, yet it may be false. If I were beginning again, I would not accept the limits of my surroundings as the limits of my ability. I would recognize that what is common is not necessarily what is possible. I would separate what I observe from what I choose to believe. This requires awareness, and it requires decision. There may be resistance. For a man who begins to think differently from those around him often feels a sense of separation. He may be questioned. He may be doubted. He may feel the pressure to return to familiar patterns. This pressure is natural. It is the environment seeking to maintain itself. But if the man yields to it, he returns to the same condition. If he resists it, he begins to change. If I were beginning again, I would not expect immediate comfort in changing my environment or my relation to it. I would expect adjustment. I would expect moments of uncertainty, yet I would continue. For the influence of environment, once altered, produces new repetition. New ideas are introduced, new expectations are formed, new standards are observed. And through repeated exposure, these begin to replace the old. There is also a form of environment that is not physical. It is the environment of thought itself, what a man reads, what he listens to, what he permits to occupy his attention. These two form repetition, and repetition forms belief. Thus, environment is not limited to place or association. It includes all that enters the mind regularly. If I were beginning again, I would be deliberate not only in where I stand, but in what I allow to reach me. I would not expose myself continually to ideas that weaken direction. I would not permit repeated influence that diminishes expectation. For each exposure contributes, whether noticed or not. There is also a transformation that occurs when a man changes his environment. At first, the change may be subtle. He hears different conversations. He observes different actions. He notices a different standard of thinking. Over time, these impressions accumulate. They begin to shape his own thoughts. He begins to expect more. He begins to consider possibilities that once seemed distant. And in this shift, his actions change. Others will observe this change. They will notice that he no longer speaks as before. His language alters. His outlook expands. He appears more certain, more directed, more capable of sustained effort. They may attribute this to personal development. But the cause is influence. changed, directed, chosen. If I were to express this as instruction, I would say, choose your environment with care, for it supplies the repetition that shapes your thinking. Let this be fixed firmly within. I choose what surrounds me. I select what influences me. I direct the conditions that shape my thinking. Repeat this not as suggestion, but as decision. For the man who directs his environment directs his repetition, and the man who directs his repetition directs his belief. Thus, if I were to begin again from nothing, having gained awareness and control over repetition, I would do this next. I would choose my environment, for in choosing it, I would determine the thoughts that return to me, and in determining those thoughts, I would shape the direction of my life. Having understood that repetition and environment shape the thoughts that enter the mind, the next realization, if I were to begin again, is that these thoughts do not remain as passing impressions. They gather, they settle, and in time they form beliefs. These beliefs are seldom declared, they are assumed, and once assumed...
What you have just listened to was only the first half of this lecture. Access the full lecture through the first link in the description. By the way, hey, I'm Jan, the founder of this channel. I've started this channel and wanted to stay in the background and keep the main focus on the message of this channel. But as our community continued to grow, I decided to take the responsibility and step up and build a community around these teachings. So hey, nice to meet you, I'm Jan, and don't forget to access the full tape through the first link in the description.